Pushing his way through the crowded streets of downtown ancient Rome, a man called Artemidorus clutched a piece of parchment in his hands and made his way through the crowd towards the man who was at the center of attention. The crowd was gathered around the most powerful man in all the Republic, the dictator for life, Gaius Julius Caesar. They clamored around the statesman, seeking his attention on proposals, appeals, or any number of other responsibilities that befell the dictator. It was nearly impossible to get close to Caesar. Aside from the crowd of senators and lobbyists, the dictator also had his own band of strong and capable loyalists around him. Though he had officially disbanded his bodyguard so as to appear more accessible, Caesar was still protected by his veterans and soldiers from his former legions, men who loved him and who owed him absolute loyalty, men who were bodyguards in all but name. Caesar was not only dictator for life, he was also a consul of Rome, as well as its chief priest. He was a man of many responsibilities. Thousands of people demanded his time. Getting close to him would be nearly impossible. Getting a piece of paper in his hands was even less likely. Still, it had to be done, for written on that piece of parchment was a warning to Caesar, a warning that told him not to trust his fellow senators, a warning of the plot on his life that was already underway, a warning that told him not to attend the very meeting he was on his way to. Against all odds, Artemidorus made it to Caesar's side, and he pressed the scroll into the dictator's hands, pleading that he read its contents immediately. Caesar was a busy man. He was used to being handed proposed bills or written appeals. Promising to read the scroll another time, Caesar handed it off to one of his attendants and moved on. Artemidorus could have done nothing as he watched the most powerful man in the Republic, and possibly the world, walk away from him and towards a violent meeting with fate. In less than 1 hour, Caesar would be dead. This is the story of the 15th of March, 44 BC. This is the story of the Ides of March. The term Ides of March simply refers to the 74th day of the Roman calendar in the 15th of March. It was a holiday, the start of the new year. It was a day of religious celebration and sacrifices to the goddess of seasons, Anna Perenna. It was a day that was well known to Roman people. It was a day for embracing spring, a day for feasting and picnics, a day for new beginnings. It was a joyful holiday, well known to the Romans, but after the events that transpired that year in 44 BC, the 15th of March would come to be a day of mourning and of remembrance. Gaius Julius Caesar was something of a political outsider in the early years of his career. Rising through the ranks of the Roman aristocracy, Caesar began his career when he was made a pontiff, a member of the College of Priests in the Roman religion. From there he won a place as a military tribune, a high-ranking military officer, and from there he continued to climb, being made a quaestor, which made him a senator for life. Next, he was elected aedile, a public office responsible for the maintenance of public buildings, and the regulation of festivals and games. He was popular in this, hosting lavish games and ceremonies that demonstrated his family's wealth and prestige. By now, he was becoming something of a major player in Roman politics. Not content with these gains, Caesar next campaigned for the title of praetor, a commander of the army. At the same time, he also campaigned for the office of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman religion. Surprising even his contemporaries, Caesar won these posts. Though questions were raised about the legitimacy of his campaign and rumors of bribery were floated around, Caesar had nonetheless managed to secure his place as one of the most influential senators in all the Republic. In the year 60 BC, Caesar was made governor of 3 provinces, Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul. And with that, the stage was set for the second act of Caesar's political career. Caesar was no stranger to ambition. He was not a man to sit still. He wanted influence, and he wanted power. And what was the best way to attain such things in ancient Rome? Money and conquest. Caesar needed money, and he needed land. Though he had blazed a trail for himself in the world of high politics, staying there would be a different story. Politics was an incredibly expensive game. Despite his successes, Caesar was heavily in debt at this time. He'd paid huge amounts both at home and abroad, purchasing alliances and support wherever he could. If he wanted to keep his place, he needed to get rich quick. In addition to his debt, Caesar was also competing for political supremacy against 2 of the greatest names of the time. One of them was Pompey Magnus, the Republic's greatest general, and the other was Marcus Crassus, the Republic's wealthiest man, and also a capable general. If Caesar had any hope to contend with these 2 giants of the political stage, he needed more to his name than a slew of titles and popular games. He needed to win a war. Enter the Gallic Wars. For generations, the Republic's borders with the various tribes of the Gauls had been tense and unsafe. Tensions only rose as the Roman sense of superiority and their tendency to expansion clashed with the Gallic tribes. Although Rome was under no serious threat of invasion, there may have been raids or occasional skirmishing along the border. In any case, Caesar felt the need to invade, justifying his actions as a preemptive attack on a hostile people. In reality, Caesar saw his opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. By invading Gaul, he would solve his debt problem through the seizing of loot and treasure, and he could also win renown for himself and his family by defeating barbarians and going farther than any Roman general had gone before, namely, over the Rhine and even all the way to Britain. Caesar's war with the Gauls would last for 8 years, from 58 to 50 BC, and those would see some of the most comprehensive slaughter and destruction that those provinces would have ever known up to that point, before culminating at the siege and Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, where the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix was captured. Tens of thousands of Gauls would have been killed, maimed, or permanently displaced from their homes. Many thousands would have been made slaves and sent off to the gladiatorial arenas of the Republic, while others would have been made into domestic slaves or condemned to a miserable life in the mines. In the end, however, Caesar won his war, and he had won his treasure. In addition to his land, and money, he had also won another prize, the loyalty of his legions. Caesar was not only a winning tactician and a skilled commander, he was also incredibly charismatic. He shared in the hardships of his men, eating what they ate and living as they lived. Furthermore, he was a good and fair paymaster. In a time when wages and payments could be delayed, withheld, stalled, or even outright lost, Caesar was a man who never forgot to share with his soldiers their fair share of plundered loot and captured land. While he was finding success in Gaul, however, the situation back home in Rome was far less favorable to Caesar. Much had changed in the nearly 10 years that Caesar had been away in his wars. The Senate, while approving of his successes in battle, disapproved of his popularity. With all his men, all his land, and all his riches, the Senate thought that Caesar was starting to look a little too much like a king, and the Romans hated kings. What was more, Caesar's alliances with those other two political giants were falling apart. Crassus was dead, having been killed by the Parthians to the east, leaving only Caesar and Pompey. Unfortunately, the tie that bound those two together, namely Caesar's daughter, who was married to Pompey, had died in the year 54 BC. No longer Caesar's son-in-law, Pompey was soon wary of Caesar's return, just as much as the Senate was. The question of how to reintegrate Caesar into the political landscape was of chief concern. Caesar was just too wealthy, too influential, and too powerful. But it wasn't just his power and influence that drew the ire of those back in Rome. It was how he used or abused his power and influence that concerned them. When Caesar had been made governor of Illyricum in Cisalpine Gaul, he was elected for a term of 5 years, and his office of governor of Transalpine Gaul was subject to annual renewal. The Senate had likely done this as a means of checking Caesar's power, and it hadn't worked. He was more powerful now than ever. His war was over, and now he was coming home. Caesar was told to give up his provinces and disband his legions upon returning to Rome, or else be viewed as an enemy of the Republic. He refused. On the 10th of January 49 BC, Caesar and his army crossed the Rubicon, a small river that marked the border between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy. With this, his opening gambit in the Civil War, Caesar remarked, "The die is cast." As Caesar and his armies marched into northern Italy, prominent senators as well as regular Romans had to decide on which side they were going to support, Caesar and his legions, or Pompey and the Republicans. Pompey was tasked with the defense of Rome, a task at which he almost immediately failed at. Caesar's invasion of Italy was fast and effective, and by the 17th of January, he had reached the city of Rome itself. Pompey, meanwhile, withdrew from the city with a number of prominent senators and went south to regroup. Caesar would pursue Pompey and the Republicans, defeating them in Italy, Greece, and Africa. In Greece, Pompey and the Republicans were decisively defeated by Caesar. Pompey himself then escaped once again, sailing south for Egypt, while other prominent Republicans either went to North Africa or simply surrendered to the victorious dictator. Caesar would follow his old political rival across the seas to Egypt, only to find that Pompey had been murdered not long after arriving. Caesar and Pompey might have been fighting a war with one another, but they were far from bitter enemies. They respected each other. They were old colleagues. They had even once been allied to each other, with Pompey being married to Caesar's daughter. Caesar was displeased to find his old opponent had been unceremoniously murdered. Caesar and Pompey were like two old chess players that had been playing one another for years in a single game, and now that Caesar had his opponent in checkmate, someone had come along and killed him before the game could be concluded. Egypt was a land experiencing a civil war of its own, a dynastic struggle between two siblings who were meant to be co-rulers. One was a boy called Ptolemy, and the other, his sister, was called Cleopatra. Caesar became involved in the Egyptian civil war not long after Cleopatra introduced herself to him by being snuck into his quarters rolled into a rug, and the two became lovers. Caesar and Cleopatra defeated the boy Ptolemy, who drowned while he was retreating from a battle. Egypt was secured under the rule of Cleopatra, and with her visibly pregnant by the time Caesar left Egypt, it was clear that he had made a powerful ally. Even though Pompey was dead, Caesar's civil war was not over. The last of the Republicans and Pompeians who had not been killed or surrendered had retreated and regrouped in Africa. Late in the year 47 BC, Caesar arrived in North Africa and began his campaign. In April of the next year, he spectacularly defeated his adversaries at the Battle of Thapsus. Then, in March of 45 BC, at the Battle of Munda in Hispania, Caesar and his armies defeated the sons of Pompey and the very last remnants of those who had stood up to the conquering dictator. In the end, the sons of Pompey were killed, and Hispania, like every other province in the Republic, was brought under the control of Caesar. The civil war was over. With Caesar being the last man standing, the Senate in Rome declared him liberator and granted him a host of honors. Statues of him were erected in temples and along the streets. The month of his birth, Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor, modern-day July, and he was even granted the right to dress as a royal and sit on a special throne in the middle of the Senate. By concluding the wars and bringing peace back to the Republic, Caesar was seen as a semi-divine being. He had bested his many enemies, conquered vast territories, and returned a sense of order to the Republic that had been battered by civil war. On his return march to Italy, Caesar furthered his popularity by founding several colonies and securing land for his veterans. These were only the first of many reforms he would implement in the coming months. Despite the sycophancy of the Senate, not all of Caesar's new reforms and policies were so popular. He upset the Senate by increasing the number of senators and magistrates from 600 to 900. He restructured courts and jurors, reduced the grain dole, and granted citizenships to several provinces outside of the city of Rome itself. During the years of fighting, Caesar had repeatedly been elected to the post of dictator, an office that was always meant to be temporary and reserved only for times of great peril or emergency. In February of 44 BC, however, Caesar was declared dictator for life, a position very similar to that of a king. The powers and titles Caesar had accumulated over the years meant he could rule the Republic with his own authority, and nothing could be done without his approval. It wasn't long before his reforms and changes began to grate on the establishment, or what was left of it. Soon, a conspiracy was put in motion. In a lavish Roman villa, 3 prominent senators met for a secret meeting. Their names were Cassius, Brutus, and Decimus. The topic they were there to discuss was what to do about Caesar, or more specifically, how they were going to kill him. Although their individual motives may have differed slightly from man to man, each 3 of these conspirators had been Disillusioned with the reforms and the powers wielded by Caesar, they had each come to believe that they were witnessing the fall of the Republic. Cassius was a skilled soldier and a proven commander, having fought for Crassus until he was killed, then serving as an admiral under Pompey during the Civil War, where his skill and prowess won him a direct pardon from Caesar himself. Cassius had been a loyal Pompeian to the very end. Brutus, on the other hand, was not a soldier. He was a blue-blooded Roman senator from an old family of aristocrats that stretched back to the early days of the Republic. He was a staunch Republican who had gone against Caesar in the Civil War, but who had surrendered to him in Greece after Pompey's defeat. Showing his usual mercy, Caesar had forgiven Brutus and had even made him the governor of Cisalpine Gaul. Unlike other Pompeians, Caesar and Brutus had always been on good terms. Brutus's mother, Servilia, had been Caesar's mistress for many years, and Caesar may have had an almost stepfatherly interest in seeing Brutus succeed. Lastly, there was Decimus, who, up until very recently, had been a die-hard Caesarian. In the past, he had served under Caesar for over half a decade fighting in the Gallic Wars. During the Civil War, Caesar had made him a governor of Cisalpine Gaul, where he further proved himself by putting down a serious rebellion. Although he had been richly rewarded by Caesar for his service, Decimus was a Republican, and he could see the writing on the wall. Soon, Caesar would be a king. Despite the fact that the three men were each prominent senators in their own right, they knew they couldn't plan and execute an assassination on the world's most powerful man without a little extra help. Fortunately for them, they weren't the only ones who saw their republic eroding. Soon, they found the help they needed. In the following months, the conspiracy grew from 3 men to 4, then 5, 10, and eventually 60 high-profile senators and magistrates were in on the plot. Some of them were die-hard Republicans, and others were former Caesarians, but all were equally concerned about the powers Caesar had accumulated. For weeks, the conspirators met in secret to discuss their plan. The decision was quickly made to ensure that however the assassination was to be carried out, it was to be symbolically done in public. The conspirators felt that their cause was righteous. They could not conceal their faces or hide in shadows. Plots were hatched and schemes devised. The conspirators considered rushing Caesar as he crossed a bridge and hurling him over the side, or using gladiators to attack him while he gave a speech. In the end, however, the conspirators were forced to abandon their plans when Caesar suddenly announced that he would be leaving Rome on the 18th of March to head east and wage war on the Parthians. There was no telling how long Caesar would be gone, or the amount of glory he would return with, so the conspirators were forced to act. They now had a deadline. Coming to a consensus, the conspirators decided to carry out their plot on the Ides of March, during a meeting of the Senate. The plan had its pros and cons. On one hand, the conspirators would be able to kill Caesar in a public place without also having to deal with the presence of his guards, as they would be forbidden from attending the meeting. On the other hand, their plan required the smuggling of weapons into the Senate chamber, which was an offense punishable by death. What was more, the Senate was a sacred institution with laws and codes that dated back to the foundation of the Republic. To commit a murder in such a setting would be extremely symbolic, but it would also be a terrible violation of sacred laws. There was nothing to be done, however. If the conspirators didn't act on the Ides of March, they would miss their chance, possibly forever. "What about Mark Antony?" someone asked. Mark Antony was Caesar's co-consul and old friend. He was the closest thing Caesar had to a second-in-command. and he would undoubtedly be by the dictator's side. Antony was a soldier and a fighting man. He would almost certainly come to the aid of Caesar, and he might even be able to save him. One of the conspirators, Trebonius, who was familiar with Antony, was tasked with stalling him outside the Senate chambers long enough for the other conspirators inside to strike. And with that, the plan was set. Caesar had been warned by a priest called Spirina to beware the Ides of March. It may be that Spirina had contacts inside the conspiracy, or perhaps he simply heard rumors. Maybe he really could see the future from studying the entrails of animals, but in any case, Caesar seemingly ignored the warnings. On the morning of the Ides, while Caesar was performing a ceremony in his office as high priest, he saw Spirina and mockingly called out to him, "The Ides of March have come." "Yes," replied the priest, "but they have not yet gone." Which brings us back to where we left off at the beginning of this video, with Caesar and his attendants arriving at the Senate meeting. For the conspirators, the atmosphere must have been tense. Cassius, Brutus, and the others lingered outside the Senate chamber and watched as the most powerful man in the Republic arrived and began interacting with other senators. Perhaps adjusting the daggers concealed under their cloaks, the conspirators positioned themselves and did their best to appear relaxed. As Caesar and Mark Antony approached, the other senators fell in behind them and began filing into the Senate chamber. Right on cue, the conspirator Trebonius stepped forward and stopped Mark Antony, pulling him aside for a private word. Proceeding into the chamber, Caesar would have taken his seat on his throne while the other senators filled in and took their seats. Only, not all the senators sat down. The conspirators began to move forward, forming a perimeter around Caesar, while one of their own, a man called Cimber, approached Caesar and distracted him by asking for a pardon on behalf of his brother who had been a Pompeian during the Civil War. Caesar refused and explained his reasoning, all while the conspirators drew in around him. Directly behind the seated dictator, one of the conspirators, a man called Casca, positioned himself. Cimber then approached Caesar. In the next instant, he reached out and grabbed Caesar by his toga, yanking hard on it. This was the predetermined signal for the others to attack. Ripping his toga from Cimber's grip, Caesar never saw the first strike coming. Standing directly behind Caesar, Casca drew out his dagger and brought it down on the dictator. But his aim was poor, and rather than striking a fatal blow, the blade only grazed Caesar's shoulder. Lurching to his feet, Caesar spun and wrestled with Casca, shouting, "Casca, you villain! What are you doing?" Casca and Caesar had known each other since childhood. For a few brief moments, the conspirators, as well as the other senators, looked on in stunned confusion. No one seemed able to move as Caesar and Casca wrestled for the blade. "Brother, help me!" Casca shouted at his brother Titidius, a fellow conspirator who stood only a few paces away. At this, the rest of the chamber erupted into action as other conspirators rushed forward. A few senators from outside the conspiracy lurched to their feet and tried to rush to Caesar's aid, but they were stopped. Meanwhile, having broken free from Casca, Caesar turned to see Cassius in front of him. Pulling his dagger from his cloak, Cassius slashed at Caesar, cutting him across the face and sending him staggering to one side. In the next instant, Caesar gasped as he was stabbed between the ribs by Casca's brother, Titidius. Then Decimus lurched forward, slashing at Caesar's thigh. The conspirators crowded around Caesar, pushing and pulling, thrusting and slashing, before the dictator eventually fell down, bleeding at the base of a statue of Pompey. But although he was wounded, he was not yet dead. Emerging from the group of conspirators, Brutus stepped slowly forward with his dagger held firmly in one hand, and he knelt down beside Caesar. Seeing that Brutus, his mistress's son and a man he had pardoned, was one of the conspirators, Caesar said, "You too, my child?" Brutus then stabbed Caesar in the groin. In a spreading pool of blood, Julius Caesar pulled his toga over his face, and he died. In the following minutes, several other conspirators stepped forward to stab Caesar's corpse, while many of those who were not part of the conspiracy fled the chamber in distress. Although Caesar had been killed, the conspirators did not succeed in their ultimate goal of preserving the Republic. In the following years, Rome would once again be plunged into civil war as Caesar's supporters waged war against his killers. But that is a story for a different time. Hey, thanks for watching the video. Caesar was one of the first historical figures I ever really took an interest in when I was just a kid. With today being the Ides of March, I figured it was a perfect time to make a video on the topic. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like or a comment or subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And a big thanks to everyone who's already supporting the channel. Every like and every comment really go a long way. I'll see you in the next one.